things. All of that information is in there as well. So take it away, Pat, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the this month's North Central Climate Summary and Outlook webinar. I just put a few pictures up on the initial slide just to kind of highlight what much of the North Central region has been experiencing over the past 30 days or so, for over about the past 6 weeks. We've had some very cold October and conditions, and even snowy ones at the end of the month, and that is actually and that has spilled over into the month of November. And
hey, Pat.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry. I think I might not have hit the right button there, and let me reintroduce everybody because I think I didn't hit the actual button to introduce.
Oh, okay.
So,
all right.
I hit the record button, but I don't think I said show your screen and all that stuff. So anyway, hi. This is Doug Cluck from NOAA. I'm actually in St. Paul today, working remotely, and hopefully this whole thing will go smoothly. It never does, but we're going to try anyway. And I just want to introduce our presenter today is Pat Gannon, who is the state climatologist for the state of Missouri. And then also note that Dennis Toddy from USDA Climate Ag Hub will also be in the background, and we'll answer questions that hopefully you guys can, if any questions you happen to come up with, there is an interface within the webinar structure to ask or type questions in there. We'll get to those at the end. So thank you all very much. And Pat, sorry about that. Let's start over. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this month's North Central U.S. Climate Summary and Outlook webinar. The first slide, I think, is kind of representative of what we've seen across much of the North Central region over about the past 6 weeks. We had a very cold October, especially towards the end of October. We saw some snow as well. And those conditions have spilled over into much of the month of November with some snow and extreme cold. And so I think these are very appropriate to highlight basically what the theme has been weather-wise across much of the North Central region over the past month. First of all, just some general information on providing climate services to the Central region, a listing of folks who all participate and contribute. And next month, Dr. Adnan Akuz, North Dakota State climatologist, will be presenting the December Drought Outlook webinar. And to access the future climate webinars and past recordings are the links provided below there. And we'll, of course, we'll entertain questions at the end. In regard to the structure of the webinar today, first talk a little bit about some conditions that we've seen for this year, and I'd like to highlight just some of the unusual nature of the temperature and precipitation patterns as not only the North Central U.S., but the U.S. as a whole. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about last month, give a recap for the month of October. We'll look at the conditions we've seen so far during the first 3 weeks of November, a little touch base on snow, water, flood, and drought topics. We'll dive into agriculture. Obviously, there's been a lot of impacts with the weather this harvest season across the North Central region on agriculture. We'll look at localized state impacts and go into climate outlooks and wrap it up with questions and comments. So let's go into the first 10 months of 2019. What's been very interesting, and I've highlighted on the right with 3 monthly maps, but on the left are the statewide average temperature ranks for January through October for the contiguous United States. Anything in the blues are below normal 10-month periods. Anything in the reds are above normal. The darker shades of red indicate record warm. So the mid-Atlantic states down to Florida are witnessing their warmest January through October on record. And so look to the northwest, at the same time, we see this big temperature gradient in regard to the disparities of what we're seeing in anomalies. Parts of the North Central U.S., North Dakota or South Dakota is witnessing their 7th coldest January through October on record. And so what's been sort of a persistent theme on the right, those 3 maps, are indicative of the big temperature gradient, the big anomalies we've seen from much below normal conditions during the month of February, and then in the southeastern U.S., much above normal conditions. Below that, the month of May, we had below normal temperatures across much of the north central and southwestern U.S., above normal temperatures in the southeast. And then last month, October, again, very cold conditions across much of the western half of the country, above normal conditions in the southeastern U.S. And so when I look at those type of features, that's indicative of a jet stream that's fairly robust with that strong temperature gradient, and that it intersects or bisects the middle part of the country, running from the southwest to the northeast. And of course, the jet stream dictates what happens at the surface when it comes to weather conditions. And so we're seeing basically a storm track that's been coming and going throughout much of the year and bringing us some really high precipitation totals. And I'll reflect that in this next image. So these are the statewide precipitation ranks for, again, January through October. Anything in green is above normal precipitation. Anything in white, a white is near average, and in that shade of brown is a below average precipitation. And it's pretty dominant. You can see a lot of green across the map. In fact, the average January through October total for the contiguous U.S. was 30.25 inches. That's never happened before. When you look back on records in the lower right, going all the way back to 1895 to 2019, this is January through October, contiguous U.S. average precipitation. You can see we're in uncharted territory. On the far upper right, that's 2019. It's the first time in, 125 years that we've seen an average contiguous U.S. total between January and October of over 30 inches. And in fact, states with the wettest January through October on record in the north central U.S., South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, some exceptionally wet conditions. And on the bottom left, the table that's indicative of the table on the bottom right, again, 2019, wettest January through October on record. Interestingly, 2018, 2017 all fall in the top 5. So not only this year has it been exceptionally wet, we are unprecedented when you look at the past 3 years in regard to the persistent wetness in 2017, 2018, and 2019 for the contiguous U.S. as a whole. So let's look at last month and give a little bit of an October recap. It was, again, sort of a flip in temperature anomalies. We had a very warm September across much of the north central U.S. It was, in fact, the 5th warmest for the region. And obviously, we had a notable significant pattern change. On the upper right, we went from our 5th warmest September to our 10th coldest October. So again, just from one extreme to another, as we went into the fall season. Bottom left shows the record high temperatures that were being broken across in the first week of October across the Midwest versus the last week of October, where we saw several low temperature records. So just incredible disparity from September into October that we saw with temperatures this year. So this is the statewide average temperature ranks for the month of October. Again, the blues below normal temperatures for the states, and in the oranges and various shades of oranges above normal temperatures. And it's been pretty much cooler than average from the Pacific Northwest to generally west of the Mississippi River, warmer than average conditions generally east of the Mississippi River, and top 10 coldest actually for many states in the northwest quarter of the U.S. versus top 10 warmest states in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern U.S. And Idaho had their coldest October on record. And so in Wyoming, number 2, Utah, number 2, Montana, number 3, and Washington, number 2. Some very cold October conditions across much of the northwest quarter of the United States. And we saw record cold minimum temperatures as well. Just to highlight, breaking up the average temperature and showing on the lower left and lower right the maximum temperature ranks for October versus the minimum temperature ranks for October. And those minimum temperatures went really low for several days across parts of the Rocky Mountain states. In fact, Idaho, Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, Colorado all witnessed their coldest monthly average minimum for the month of October for temperatures. And at the same time, Florida had their warmest minimum temperatures. Very far bottom right, those were the number of October daily records that were set. Over 2,600 high temperature records were set, mostly across the southeast during the month of October, versus many more minimum temperature records across the northwest quarter of the U.S. Over 4,479 total was the latest number for that. October precipitation, it was a wet one across the middle part of the country, a little bit of dryness across the western U.S., above average precipitation across the eastern half of the U.S., and also including the Dakotas and Oklahoma. But as I had mentioned, below average, especially in parts of Oregon, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and Colorado. It was the top 10 driest October for California and Arizona. Of course, we heard a lot about the wildfires that were ongoing last month across California and into Arizona, versus the top 10 wettest October for several states in the eastern half of the U.S. And Mississippi actually did have their wettest October on record. Some interesting weather features that occurred during the month of October. We had an early season snowstorm that went across the Rockies and into the Midwest. It was accompanied by bitter cold temperatures during the last week of October, especially the last few days of the month. We had all-time low temperature records for October were set across many locations in the West, all the way with some areas from Montana to New Mexico dipping below zero for the month of October. And that box, the table on the right, actually indicates some all-time state daily minimum temperature records for the entire month of October. Utah, the location Peter Sink, Utah, that's in the northeastern corner of the state, and you can see that little shading in there that's indicative of anywhere from, it says below 40 degrees below zero, and in fact, Utah did, Peter Sink location reported a temperature on the 30th of October of 46 degrees below zero, and up in Idaho, Daniel Fish Hatchery on the 30th reported a low temperature of 34 degrees below zero, some exceptional cold for the month of October, and you could see the temperatures that went below 10 degrees below zero or lower was in parts of southwestern Montana, much of western Wyoming, eastern Idaho, on into Utah and parts of north central Colorado. So the snow that we witnessed across the Midwest actually broke some records, and on the left are some daily snowfall records that were broken or tied during the month of October. We had a system move through right at the end of the month. It was, I think it was Halloween was a little bit more trick and less treat in regard to the snow that fell on Halloween. But those purple dots are indicative of some daily snowfall records, much of them on the 30th and the 31st. On the right, you can see a table showing some of the snowfall accumulations. Heaviest were occurred in far northeastern Missouri, extending up into eastern Iowa, northwestern Illinois, and on into southern Wisconsin, where there were some reports of definitely 6 to up to 8 or more inches of snow in that heaviest corridor on the map on the right. There's an interesting, I've been talking a lot about the cold that we've been seeing in October and November, and it's nice to also just sort of provide a global perspective on not only has it been unusually cold during the past 6 weeks or so across the north central region, but when you look at on the global picture, when you look at temperature anomalies, this on the left is a global picture for the month of October, the temperature departure from normals. Anything in reds is indicative of above normal temperatures, anything in various shades of blue, below normal temperatures. The darkest blues are the biggest departures from normal, and pretty much you see the bullseye right over the north central U.S., parts of southern Canada. When you look at it compared to the globe, we were by far, had the largest departures from normal for the month of October. At the same time, we saw some near record warmth across Alaska, much of the northern Canada and the Arctic area, northern Europe, parts of Western Australia, and just a lot, most of the globe it was very warm, with the exception of the north central region. In fact, it was the second warmest October on record for the globe. 2015 still ranks as the warmest. And the most notable cooler than average temperatures, again, were found across the western half of the contiguous U.S. and southwestern Canada. On the right is the January through October map, again showing that little blue blob right over the north central U.S. and southern Canada. That's the only part of the world, for that matter, where we're seeing these big departures from normal, or most significant departures from normal. A little bit perhaps around Malaysia, but overall some very warm conditions across the Arctic, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, Alaska especially. We're the only area, part of the globe, where we've been seeing this persistent, somewhat of a cooler weather trend compared to average. And in fact, if you look at this for the January through October period for the globe, it was the second warmest on record. 2016 still ranks as the warmest. And again, the most notable cooler than average temps were found across the north central U.S. into south central Canada. So let's look at this month. How have conditions been? We've had these cold October conditions. They have spilled into the month of November across the north central U.S. The coldest departures are across the eastern half of the National Weather Service Central Region, extending, looking like the arrowhead of Minnesota down through eastern Iowa, eastern Missouri. We've seen these departures that are running more than 9-10 degrees below normal for the first 3 weeks of November. At the same time, a little bit of a warming occurring on the western part of the central region, where seasonably mild temperatures have been impacting the northern and the central Rockies. Just the five maps below are somewhat indicators of other cold November 1st through 20th periods over the past 30 years, 1991, 1996, 2000, 2014, and 2018. And just a side note, when I looked at what happened, looking at those five cold Novembers at the bottom, what happened that following winter, just to see if there was any sort of relationship, but there really isn't. I will say that the winter of 1991 and 92 actually ranked as the warmest on record for the north central region. There were actually then 2 months that were near normal and one month below normal. So it varied. There's really no good indicator on perhaps looking at the maps on what to perhaps expect for the following winter, just using that as a basis. For precipitation, dry conditions have prevailed in November across most of the north central region. That actually has helped somewhat in regard to harvest. Harvest has been really impacted by these cold conditions in October and into the first half or so of November. And that's been provided a little bit better harvesting opportunities in some parts of the north central region during the month of November because it was so wet in October and cold as well. There are pockets of wetter conditions in Montana, north central Wyoming, and western North Dakota. But overall, somewhat of a drier scenario ongoing. Of course, we are going into the winter season, and as you go north, those normal precipitation for the winter months go down when you compare them to the spring and summer seasons. Cold and snowy. We had a very cold period in November. These are records, low temperature records that were broken across the Midwest during the week of November 10th through the 16th. Very cold conditions, most notably, I believe it was on November 11th, November 12th. We saw very cold conditions. They were breaking records that had stood for over a century, all the way back to 1911. We had some broken from 1940. Many low temperature records, and then there were some snow as well, impacting much of the Midwest. On the right is a map of accumulated snowfall showing some of the heavier totals across, again, eastern Iowa, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, somewhat of a lake effect enhancement impacting parts of Michigan, the UP of Michigan, with some higher snow totals going over 15 inches in some locations. And that actually extended down into Ohio and much of Indiana, even some snow reports into Kentucky, which was unusual for the month of November. Let's look at the snow and water sort of conditions that we've been seeing. Now, this obviously is a very early map when we talk about snow and the snow season across the Rockies and across the western U.S. But this is a map from the NRCS on snow water equivalent. There are some watersheds in western Montana, northern and eastern Wyoming, and north central Colorado that are running in excess of 100% snow water equivalent. A little bit drier or less snow as you go west, far western Montana into Idaho and the Pacific Northwest. In fact, the red is indicative of less than 50% of snow water equivalent for the Pac Northwest, Great Basin area, and southwestern Colorado, particularly the San Juan Basin that extends down into New Mexico, southern Colorado. Not a lot of snow yet, but again, it is very early. We still have a lot, several months to go through to see how things evolve over the winter and into spring for snow water equivalent across the western U.S. The current snow water equivalent, this is from the National Snow Analysis, the Office of Water Prediction, showing today the snows across the Canadian Rockies extending down into the southern Rockies, the Wasatch, and even a little bit of the Sierra Nevada. You can see some snow. Looks like there was some snow with this recent system that moved through over parts of northeast Colorado, western Nebraska, southwest South Dakota, and then a little stripe of snow extending on the Canada-U.S. border from northern Montana over into North Dakota, Minnesota, and of course into the UP and parts of Michigan where they had that lake effect from the big lake effect snow event that they had earlier in the month. This is a picture of the Missouri River Basin, the mountain snowpack water content. Again, this is very early, but it's just showing slightly above average. You see the blue line, that is for this year, and it's running right about where the red line is the average, and so it's slightly above average for the middle part of November. Similarly, this is the total above Fort Peck on the left, and the total from Fort Peck to Garrison, the mountain snowpack is again near normal, maybe perhaps slightly above average. But I want to emphasize, of course, the season is just beginning, and so a lot more time just to see how things transpire over the next several months. The Platte River Basin, mountain snowpack water content, again, it's running slightly above average in the total North Platte on the left, showing 102% of average, where that blue line, that blue arrow points to is for mid-November. And then the total South Platte on the right, running slightly below average, 94% of average for mid-November. And again, the season has just begun. Looking at stream flows across the country, this is the 7-day average stream flow map compared to historical stream flow for this time of year. Generally above to much above average stream flows across the Missouri and upper Mississippi River basins, near to below average stream flows in Colorado and southwest Nebraska and the Ohio River Basin. But we still have several ongoing record stream flows that extend in those black dots from Montana down southeastward into Nebraska and then up into Iowa and over in Wisconsin. So the stream flows, they're still running high across much of the Missouri and upper and central Mississippi River basins. Looking at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, showing conditions looking down into Missouri, those brownish orange dots indicate minor flood levels along the Missouri River. As you go south to Kansas River in eastern Kansas and parts of far west central Missouri, no flooding. The minor flooding extends until about mid-Missouri and then goes below flood stage in the eastern part of Missouri. There are, I believe, the purple dots do indicate major flooding along the James River in South Dakota. That's a slow and somewhat of a flat river, and so it takes a little bit more time for that water to come out, but they are indicating major flooding along the James River as of today. So this is a reservoir status for the Missouri River Basin, looking at the current reservoir levels, and they're all on the lower left image shows for the Fort Peck, Garrison, Wahey. They're showing pretty much annual flood control in the range of annual flood control and multiple use. The Corps is slightly ahead of schedule in evacuating the flood control storage of the Missouri River main stem system, and this is allowing the Corps to reduce releases slightly at the end of November. As you can see in the lower right attachment, they will begin reductions in a couple days on November 23rd, and anticipating to reach winter rate approximately by mid-December. And so even with the slightly reduced reservoir releases, the Corps will evacuate all stored floodwaters by the beginning of the next runoff season, which is about March 1st. And the flood storage capacity will be available for the 2020 runoff season. And the image in the upper right just sort of indicates how much water has been in the Missouri River Basin this year. The red line indicates where we are right now, and there's been only one other time where system storage was higher, and that was in 2011. So, but you can see it's ranking right up there with 2011, and the forecasted calendar year runoff as of November 1st, the forecast was 60.2 million acre feet, which was 238% of normal, and it will be the second highest runoff year in the upper Missouri Basin, and it only falls behind what happened in 2011, which was 61 million acre feet. Looking at the North Central River Forecast Center, the upper Mississippi down into the central Mississippi River Basin, you can see the greens, those river levels have gone down somewhat. No flooding. There is in the yellow near flood stage across several rivers and streams in Wisconsin, but for the most part, no minor flooding or worse ongoing along the northern Mississippi down to the central Mississippi River Basin. Similarly, in the Ohio River Basin, this is a snapshot showing all the greens, which is indicative of no flooding in the Ohio River Basin. The Great Lakes are still running very high. These are snapshots from yesterday showing lake levels at Lake Superior, at Lake Michigan, Huron, and Lake Erie. And the light blue line is the record high daily lake level, and the darker blue line is the level that we are seeing currently in 2019. And you can see they are near record levels at Lake Superior, at Lake Michigan, a little bit lower at Lake Erie, but nonetheless, they're all running above average. The green line is indicative of average daily levels, and so the lakes are also high as well. Drought. There has been some dryness emerging across parts of the southwestern National Weather Service's central region, in particular southwest Wyoming, southwestern and southern Colorado, and some more development or emerging of dry conditions across the western half of Kansas, even a slice of D3 where there have been reports that extreme drought corridor you see in southwest Kansas, some reports they've seen less than a half inch of precipitation since the beginning of September. So obviously some very dry conditions in portions of southwestern Kansas. And if you look really hard, you can see what a difference a month makes in regard to what Kentucky experienced with one of their, I believe it was their driest September on record, also one of their hottest Septembers on record. And then they had a flip. I believe they had their third wettest October on record in Kentucky. We went from drought covering much of the state to now just a sliver of abnormally dry conditions hugging those southeastern counties. So big improvements across parts of, especially parts of southern Illinois, southeast Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and all of Kentucky over the past several weeks when it comes to drought. Agriculture, let's look at soil temperatures. soils with these cold conditions, and in November, especially earlier in November, we did see some frozen soils. There's been a little bit of somewhat of a thawing out over the past week or so. The white dots in North Dakota indicate that those soils are beginning to have a frost line at 4 inches, and so that probably extends into the northern half of Minnesota, where perhaps some frozen soils, but overall across at least the lower Midwest, you can see that there is no frost line, and I believe there's been enough thawing in South and North or Nebraska and Iowa where I don't believe there's any frost line in the soil there as well. So initially the frozen soils would have been good for producers getting in their field and resuming harvesting their harvesting with the frozen ground, but now that things are softening up with the soils frozen, it's making it a little bit more challenging to be able to get in the field. Looking at the topsoil moisture maps from the National Ag Statistics Service, on the left, the topsoil moisture showing the percentage that of the state that's running short to very short. Those brown colors or deeper shaded browns indicate a higher percentage of the state in percent short to very short. Of course, California, some very dry conditions, as well as New Mexico and parts of the Southwest. We're seeing increases with not a lot of precipitation during the month. We're seeing those levels go up across the southwestern U.S. On the right are the percent surpluses. We still have wet conditions across much of the north central U.S. that extends from the Dakotas eastward into the northeastern U.S., where topsoil moisture percent surplus is a little wetter conditions, soil moisture conditions ongoing in that part of the country. Corn harvest. Of course, it's been a very challenging year for harvest, especially with the cold and wet conditions in October, the cold conditions continuing into November. The snowy conditions have made it very difficult for fieldwork activity and for getting in the fields and harvesting. And so these maps are somewhat indicative of those challenges that producers have seen across much of the Corn Belt this year, not only for the I would say challenges for the entire growing season, but of course they're ongoing into the fall, and those darker colors of brown are indicating how far behind corn harvest is. In South Dakota, for example, only 23% of the corn has been harvested as of November 17th, when typically it should be about 85%. And so it's just really showing what these wet conditions, snowy conditions have really made it challenging for farmers to complete their harvest. And just a little bit of perspective, it's the second slowest corn harvest in a decade. You have to go all the way back to 2009 to find a slower time for corn harvest. And then a little bit of a table just shows below that, of course, 2009, only 58% of the U.S. corn had been harvested versus this year at 76%. And of course, 2009 was an exceptionally wet October across much of the Corn Belt. Sorghum progress, similarly, it's running a little bit behind in South Dakota and Nebraska, a little bit drier conditions in Colorado down into Texas, and so some actually they've improved in regard to their progress on harvesting the sorghum. Soybean is showing, again, some difficulties in getting all the soybean in. Furthest running behind across North Dakota over into Wisconsin and Michigan with those cold conditions. And that actually, those below normal conditions for percent harvested also are running behind across pretty much all of the Corn Belt, especially as you work your way into Iowa and Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Sunflowers, of course, a lot of the sunflower crop is grown in the Dakotas and Kansas and parts of Colorado, but North Dakota has really been hit hard with farmers being challenged getting into the field to harvest their sunflowers, and they're running more than 50 percentage points behind what is typically harvested by this time of year, which would be about 84%. They're only at 34%, and so running well behind in that. and of course, hopefully we'll see some better conditions. But it's already middle part of November, and the winter wheat progress, percent planted. Not a lot of change compared to the 5-year average for all the winter wheat states as a whole, and looks like it's, of course, Kansas and Oklahoma, and parts of Nebraska, northeast Colorado, a lot of winter wheat grown in that region, and a little bit better in regard to percent planting. Of course, they've had drier conditions, more opportunities, and but it on the right shows the winter wheat that has emerged. Perhaps those drier conditions have not provided opportunities for seed germination in Kansas and parts of Colorado, and you see a little bit a downturn on the percentage that was typically emerged by this time of year, and perhaps that cold snap and then drier conditions might have been contributing towards that. Winter wheat conditions on a whole, a little bit of a slight change from last week, but a little over half is considered good to excellent. Better improvement across South Dakota and Nebraska and Washington and Oregon and Montana, as well as Colorado and North Carolina. So let's look at some of the impacts that we've seen with these cold conditions over the past 6 weeks. Some wet conditions in October, of course, have made it challenging. And when you look at the region as a whole, these cold October, November conditions, in combination with the wet and snowy periods, have made it challenging for farmers this year. Crop harvest was running several weeks behind normal across the region, and the extreme wetness was creating other problems related to crop disease, grain dry down, stalk lodging, winter wheat planting, compaction, and even fieldwork preparation for next year. There were late planted crops this year, and they were slow to emerge because of those very wet conditions. And in some cases, we did see some damage to the crops that hadn't matured yet by some of the October freezes we saw across parts of the Corn Belt. There have also been many reports in several of the states, the Corn Belt states, of propane shortages and issues with distribution of the propane. And so that obviously impacts grain drying and livestock in some of these states, and these cold and wet conditions have really also led to some high moisture content in the seed, which does slow the natural dry down that occurs in the fields. So what I'm showing here, I just sort of showed the north central region and just kind of highlighted from a lot of great comments that I received over the past several days from folks residing in these states, and sort of the impacts we're seeing because of these cold conditions in October, the wet conditions we've seen, as well as what's spilled into the month of November, where it's been fairly cold as well, with some snowy periods. I don't think I'll go through every state, but I think the big common theme that I'm seeing when I received these reports from folks was just how difficult a harvest season it's been, and especially because of the cold and snowy conditions, and not a lot of opportunity to get in the field and at the same time, the moist conditions, the high seed moisture content, the propane shortages that occurred because of the cold conditions, because of the high seed moisture content, has really just sort of been challenging for producers. And so it's, again, not only for this fall, but throughout much of the growing season, just a lot going on, and so there were a few interesting, like in Minnesota, there were reports that it's been so cold that the small lakes and ponds had been freezing all the way down to the border of Missouri, which was about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than usual to see that. And so there was ice fishing ongoing, and even reports of ice rescues because the ice really hadn't been thick enough. And so there was some impact to that cold weather that we saw. And here in Missouri, we actually saw some of the smaller ponds freeze over, which we have a lot of beef cattle in Missouri, and so producers were forced to have to chop the ice in order for their cattle to access water. And fortunately, the warmer conditions over the past few days, we've seen some melting, and that's no longer an issue. So let's look at the climate outlooks. The structure for the outlooks, we'll look at the 7-day precipitation forecast, a 6 to 10-day outlook, as well as the predictions for El Nino, Southern Oscillation, the new Climate Prediction Center outlook for the month of December, as well as the winter outlook, and then we'll go out one more 3-month period looking at January, February, and March. So that's sort of late winter into starting to approach spring outlook. This wet pattern that we've seen for the year, for that matter, for a good portion of the north central U.S., this is a forecast over the next 7 days. Now, we did get a little bit of a respite in regard to precipitation in November. It's actually been running a little bit below normal across much of the north central region, but it does, if this is a forecast that verifies over the next week, it does appear that we're going to see some wetter conditions return. I see a lot of green, I see a lot of blue on the map, and there is a system currently that it actually impacted the southwestern U.S. It's moving across the Midwest today, but there is another notable system starting next week that could perhaps impact the country. So it looks like a more unsettled, stormy period, and it looks like the highest likelihood of, at least in the middle part of the country, looks like southeast, those shades of blue are anywhere from as much as a half to an inch and a half of rain. The other shades that you see across Arkansas, extending across Tennessee, into parts of West Virginia, those could be totals going from 2 to 3 inches. So some notable precipitation events. It looks like at least the heaviest, maybe perhaps some snow across the Rockies with those shades of blue that could bring some decent snowpack if this verifies over the next 7 days. This is a 2-week outlook for temperature and precipitation. Temperature on the left, this covers the period November 28th. That'll take us from Thanksgiving Day into the first few days of December. The blues are indicators for an enhanced likelihood of below normal temperatures. The darker those shades of blue, the higher the confidence that the forecast will verify. So it does appear, at least on this 2-week outlook, starting next week on Thanksgiving Day and on into December, a somewhat of a cold pattern setting up across much of the northwestern U.S., and then it translates eastward and across the northern plains and upper Midwest. At the same time, the southeastern U.S., those shades of orange are indicative of an enhanced likelihood of above normal temperatures, and so it looks like perhaps warmer conditions across Texas to Florida on up the East Coast into Maine. On the right, those greens are indicative of an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation, higher likelihoods as you work your way north and west, especially the southwest around the Great Basin area on into California. But much of the U.S. is actually covered in green, and so a stormy period setting up, it appears, with this one system moving through today and then another one perhaps targeting the country next week. This is the ENSO Forecast, El Nino Southern Oscillation. The alert system currently is not active. We are in a neutral period, no La Nina, no El Nino, and this neutral period is favored to persist or continue into the winter. In fact, they give it about a 70% chance. The various spaghetti lines you see here are an ensemble of dynamical forecasts, statistical forecasts, a consolidated forecast from CPC, and again, they are indicating that neutral condition to continue into the winter and even through the spring of 2020. They're giving about a 60 to 65% chance of those neutral conditions continuing. This is the December outlook that just hot off the press this morning from the Climate Prediction Center, indicated again those shades of orange are enhanced likelihoods of above normal temperatures. The deeper those shades of orange, the higher likelihood or better confidence that they have that the forecast will verify. And you can see much of the country, with the exception of the north central U.S., the Dakotas, northern Minnesota, parts of Montana, equal chances. That's EC, equal chances for above, below, and near normal temperatures. Whereas pretty much the rest of the country, they're indicating an enhanced likelihood of above normal temperatures to be experienced during the month of December. And on the right are the precipitation probabilities. They are showing an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation across much of the Pacific West, eastward to the Dakotas and northern Minnesota, and then that extends southward into much of the Rocky Mountains down into northern Arizona and northwestern New Mexico. The rest of the country, with the exception of the tip of Texas, the rest where they're anticipating below normal precipitation, the rest of the country in the white is equal chances for above, below, and near normal precipitation for the United States for the month of December. And then this is the winter outlook issued by the Climate Prediction Center that came out this morning. Somewhat of again, above normal temperatures are anticipated on the left for all of Alaska. That's where the highest likelihood, it looks like, across western Alaska and the Aleutians, but that extends down into much of the United States, the exception being the north central region, pretty much. It looks like equal chances for above, below, and near normal temperature is anticipated. Above normal, higher likelihoods of above normal temperatures across the southwestern U.S. that extends down to the Gulf of Mexico states. And then on the right, looks like a wetter pattern setting up, according to the Climate Prediction Center, for their forecast for the northern half of the United States. They have a enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation for the winter months. That extends with a higher likelihood across Montana into the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, down into Ohio. So, and then below normal precipitation for the winter is an enhanced likelihood across the far southwestern U.S. and parts of the south central U.S. from Texas up to southern Arkansas. We're going to jump another month to include the month of March. So this is a 3-month outlook. When you just look at the first 3 months of the year of 2020, January, February, and March, it's sort of an interesting, they're indicating perhaps from the Climate Prediction Center, they're indicating a trend towards an enhanced likelihood of below normal temperatures across the far northern plains, the upper Midwest. You see that that blue extends from North Dakota down into northern Ohio. Equal chances right in the middle, right from Montana through Missouri on into the Carolinas. And then as you go further south and west, an enhanced likelihood of above normal temperatures from January through March across the western U.S. and much of the south. On the right, it looks like this could be an interesting one if it verifies. If you got below normal across the northern U.S. and above normal precipitation, that could translate to perhaps a little bit more snow than usual. Nonetheless, it does indicate for January, February, March above normal, an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation across from Idaho all the way to western Pennsylvania, the north central U.S. So, and then below normal precipitation, an enhanced likelihood is anticipated perhaps across California through Texas into parts of Florida. So in summary, just to sort of highlight, much of the region experienced cold and wet October and the first half of November, which made it very challenging for agriculture when it comes to fieldwork activity and harvest. And there are concerns, very justifiable concerns for rivers that could freeze above flood stage as we go into winter, and the potential issues for ice jams. There perhaps a little bit of dryness that has emerged across southwest Wyoming, Colorado, western Kansas, and southwestern Nebraska. And then, of course, there are obviously going to be some spring flood concerns for the Missouri and the Mississippi River basins, and the potential delay in the spring fieldwork preparation and planting. So for further information, a little bit of further information, today's presentation will be archived on the links below. And some more information on where to access from various programs, including the NCEI, the Climate Prediction Center, and the web links are available. And thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today, and looking forward to perhaps trying to answer any of your questions that you might have or comments. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Yep, thanks, Patrick. And I don't know if I should apologize, but I just want to say that we went a little long today because of the, I guess, the number of issues that we had to describe. So we'll try to contain ourselves next time to 40 minutes. But we just had so much interesting stuff to talk about this time. So let me get to the questions as quickly as I can. Someone mentioned the fact that we don't have Canadian data, and it's really striking. And the fact that there's not Canadian data is, at least in the model, and if you're asking me about the forecasts for precipitation and temperature, if that's what you're pointing at, the reason we don't have that in there is because it is a U.S.-based climate prediction center, only does the U.S., okay? Well, only does the U.S. on those particular things. The Canadians have their own forecasting process and maps, so I would refer you to them if you want contact or email. You could probably Google it and find them if you'd like to. They don't always link up perfectly. Okay, so let me go here. I know the big issue across most of the central region is concern with all the moisture that we have and such, and the forecasts don't give us a lot of confidence that we're going to be able to escape or allow ourselves to dry out much this fall, or the rest of the fall into winter, into next spring, very much. So, of course, there are heightened concerns. Everybody has a heightened concern. I would say that the potential for flooding is enhanced. Now, NOAA and partners won't be putting out official forecasts and outlooks until sometime in February, late February and early March. We really get into it a lot more then. However, from a climate point of view, we're going to continue to watch how things evolve. Snowpack is a big issue, not only in the mountains, but across the plains and across other areas that collect a lot of snow, obviously, during the wintertime. And again, based on the outlooks that you've just seen, there is a greater cause to think that we may have above normal precipitation and below normal temperatures in certain areas that are prone to those snowpacks. So again, it's not like we're forecasting drier than normal conditions. One thing to always remember about above normal precipitation in the winter, unless you're in the mountains, sometimes that doesn't really mean a lot of moisture, because between November and, say, February, a lot of the areas that get precip, they don't get like 10 inches of water normally. So above normal can mean a lot of things. Can mean a little bit more, can mean a lot more, but again, we'll have to see how that goes. Can we attribute this to climate change, warming air temperatures, sea surface temperatures, Gulf of Mexico? This is a tough one. I won't necessarily attribute it to climate change, but certainly the fact that there is more, one of the edicts of climate change is there's more moisture available to get wrung out of the atmosphere and all that kind of business. So while I won't say that what happened in 2018 or 19 is directly attributable, I will say that is the kind of thing we'll see more, that becomes more likely into the future. I don't know, Dennis, do you want to comment, or Pat on that comment, or anything else you want to follow up in terms of concerns of spring flooding?
The precipitation situation we're dealing with, if you look at trends, it follows along with the trend we have seen in the way of precipitation, which is more, especially more in some of our transition seasons. And then just to kind of reiterate what Doug brought up about the flood and the ag issues, are that there are several pieces that have to fall in place we still don't know enough about during the winter, including snow, including how that snow melts, including how well the soil freezes. But there is something that we're quite confident about, that the soil is wet and the soil will not dry out sufficiently by next spring so that we have a very full soil moisture profile. That is why we are concerned. And then you couple that with some increased chances for precipitation, thus a heightened risk. Exactly how it plays out, we'll watch and talk about more during the winter.
Okay. Factors displacing the cold into the United States was blocking one of the culprits for that. And blocking basically means, was there a pattern in the atmosphere that was conducive to bringing a lot of polar air, and obviously Canadian air, well to the south? And in fact, that was the case. There was a displacement or an unusual pattern in the Pacific, Eastern Pacific, that allowed, or forced, to be honest, a lot of that colder air directly over the western U.S.
Pat, can you go back to that graphic you showed for the year and with the global graphic? I think it shows up really well the cold and then the warmth off to the north and west.
And also, I will say that this pattern, although it's been interrupted a few times during 2019, we've seen it. We saw it earlier in 2019 when it was so darn cold in February and such. So it's been reoccurring lately. And do I have a reason for that? I don't. I don't know. I haven't read anybody who's really got their finger on it. I think there's going to be some research, though, done on that pattern. Did you want to comment, Dennis?
No.
Okay. Yeah. That's sort of a long-term pattern, long-term being annual pattern that we've seen over and over again across the north central part of the U.S., which is very interesting. Let's see, compared to this time last year. Compared to this time last year, we sort of addressed this, potential for spring flooding and with respect to Corn Belt planting. Dennis, do you want to say anything compared to last year?
Let's see, compared to last year, there are similarities to where we are right now to where last year. There were some heavier, a little bit later season precipitation events that did not quite occur this year. So the risk is heightened. Again, like I mentioned with the flooding, what happens with the way of potential planting, there are several things that can happen that would mean that we could get planted in a reasonable situation in springtime. It's just that risk of delay is there again because we have wet soils going in, and then we have potential. Pat didn't show you the whole series, but there is a risk of cold and wet extending into the spring planting season. So if you're wet already, and wet and cold has a higher likelihood getting into late winter, early spring, the risk for delays in planting exists again. Am I recalling for a repeat of last year? No, we can't do that. But the risk is there for delays in planting and flooding again.
So the ingredients that we saw last year, and again, this is sort of ad nauseum, but the ingredients that we saw was late, well, not late, but really sort of mid-season, too late winter and spring cold. We saw a lot of ice formation on rivers and such. If you remember, that was a big deal. There was plenty of snowpack on the plains, maybe a little further south than normal. Those are all things we watch. We can get all that stuff as long as we have some melting, considerable melting in between, so it kind of runs off, if you will, in an orderly manner. Obviously, last year it did not run off in an orderly manner. It started with a bang and never quit. So, yeah, one thing doesn't necessarily lead to the other, but there are certain indicators like those that we will be watching very closely. We being Phil and all the other folks that have to deal with these issues. Northern plains, as you indicated, have been cooler than most of the world. Can you explain why? And when is that going to? And when is that going to change? And I think, Pat, you're the best one to answer that question.
I am. I wish I could tell you.
Yeah, like we said earlier, there's been this I don't know what you want to call it. It might be somebody to give a much better explanation than I can, but there has been this pattern of continued cooler air being transported to the south. Also, something we haven't mentioned yet is last spring, definitely the summer, there was a strong subtropical. We call it a Bermuda high, and you can get that's over the southeastern part of the U.S. That sort of allows more moisture to stream north. That's a pretty good ingredient for getting a lot of moisture into the center part of the country. We can't say exactly where that's going to get aimed or whatever, but that's why you also saw above normal temperatures in the southwest or southeast part of the U.S. most of this year so far. That's why they're setting record highs and all that stuff. They've been under high pressure, if you will. We've been under low pressure, if you will, and that allows a lot of moisture advection to the north. And we've talked about that on these calls in the past. Further describe, okay. Yeah, and so we just kind of talked about that, but why don't you, Pat, you did talk about jet streams being robust in the earlier slides and the difference between temperatures north and south. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Right. I mean, that has been the scenario when you have that temperature gradient. Let me try to find it here. When you have that temperature gradient set up, the differential heating, where you see these very cold conditions to the north and west and above normal temperatures to the southeast, that indicates a jet stream configuration running from a trough to the north and west, a ridge to the south and east, and that puts the storm track right in the middle part of the country. And we see this sort of situation it was in February of this year, it was in May of this year, which turned out to be one of our wettest Mays on record, and then it happened again in October. And so we're just seeing this pattern that comes and goes, but it repeats itself, and that's lent to these unprecedented wetness when we look at both basins as a whole and what we've seen so far this year. It's a player because it's that jet stream that dictates what happens at the surface, and if you're under the storm track, there's more opportunities for some widespread rain events, snow events too.
Right, and that it's very much a chicken and egg thing. You know, is it the Bermuda high? Is it the upper level low in the west? I mean, there's a lot of or is it the jet stream that's caught? You know, it's one thing does lead to the other. It's always right. Trying to predict where that's going to set up and how it sets up is key. So, and thanks Mark for your comment there at the end. That's good news that there's a lot of information coming out, I think, from the Weather Service, both locally and I think also with emergency management, and probably a lot of agricultural groups like Dennis's trying to talk about some of the challenges and getting prepared a little bit better than we were last year for what we may see. So that's all the questions I have. We're running about 5 minutes over. I appreciate everybody for hanging on as long as you have. I also really want to thank Dennis and Pat for their hard work and answering the questions today. So we'll do this again with Adnan, who is the state comptroller for North Dakota, in about a month, third Thursday. And if you have any other questions or considerations, feel free to contact any of us at any time, and we'll take them from you. So on that note, I think I'm going to say thanks to everybody, and so have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.